Welcome to London, capital of Great Britain and possibly capital of the world. A city full of iconic buildings mirroring 2,000 years of history, from the days of Rome and William the Conqueror to the glories of Victorian engineering and the marvels of 21st century architecture. However, I think you can get a better sense of history of the place, not just through its big buildings and its palaces, but by the pubs, the many hundreds of great pubs that you will find all around the city. And so for the next little while, I'm going to show you just a few of these and tell you some of their stories. We start on the north bank of the River Thames. Built in 1875 on the site of an old Dominican monastery, the building was remodelled in 1905 at the height of the arts and crafts movement in design and architecture. In some ways this was a precursor to the Art Deco movement, and this influence can be seen on some of the wall plaques. Inside there are a number of impressive copper wall panels which depict in some detail the lives of the monks that used to inhabit the buildings on this site. The reputation of some older pubs rests on their association with illustrious people from the past. These three men seem to have gone to very many pubs over the years. Our next visit is to Fleet Street and to a pub which all of them have visited at one time or another, the Old Cheshire Cheese. The original building was destroyed in the Great Fire of London in 1666, but it's a testament to its popularity that it was rebuilt very quickly the year after. And it hasn't really changed at all since 1667. Full of nooks and crannies and little dark drinking areas, it is tremendously atmospheric. We're now going to go across town to the east end of London to Spitalfields, to a pub with more grisly associations. Just across the road from the splendid 18th century Christ Church is the 10 Bells. This pub was frequented by at least one and maybe more of the victims of Jack the Ripper, and possibly by the Ripper himself. The speculation continues to this day as to who he was and to what his motives might have been. Staying in the East End, but moving back down to the river, we go to Wapping, where there are a number of pubs with great stories to tell of the sea and ships and pirates. The Prospect of Whitby was originally known as the Pelican, hence the name of this alleyway. It was built during the reign of Henry VIII, and it still has its original stone-flagged floor. That's a pretty impressive list of monarchs, going back over 470 odd years. Like all good pubs, there are plenty of little rooms to sit and chat in, and then there's a magnificent pewter-topped bar, which is a real pleasure to stand beside to have your pint. There is also a rear terrace, which usually has a fine array of fuchsia. This is because, as the sign says, the fuchsia was introduced from San Domingo and first traded in the garden of this pub. The alleyway beside the pub ends in some steps that lead down to the Thames and to the area which is known as Execution Dock. This is where those who were convicted of piracy were eventually taken down and hanged. However, their punishment didn't just end with death by hanging. Their bodies were left on the gallows until they had been covered by 3 high tides, and then the bloated corpse was taken down for burial. A bit gruesome, really. A few yards along from the prospect of Whitby stands another pub which dates back to the 1540s, although there was a pub on that site 100 years before then. The town of Ramsgate has a long seafaring history, with people such as Captain Bligh of the Bounty fame having spent time there. Like its neighbour the Prospect, there is an alleyway beside the pub that leads to a flight of stairs down to the Thames. It was here that boats would be waiting to take the unfortunates who had been sentenced to transportation onto their new life in America or Australia. A recent refurbishment has taken away some of the pub's old world charm, but that's not the same that can be said of another pub just down the road named after the most famous of pirates, Captain Kidd. The story of his buried loot, which was the source of the book Treasure Island, still excites treasure hunters today and has never been found. Kidd was eventually tried and hanged at Execution Dock. The first time they tried to hang him, the rope broke. He argued that this was a sign he was innocent and should be let go. However, they didn't take any notice of this, tried again, and this time it worked. Further east along the river from Wapping is Limehouse, an area which in the 19th century was home to a large Chinese population, as can be seen by the names of the roads. The Grapes has stood on this part of the river for nearly 500 years, and was where Sir Walter Raleigh set sail on his 3rd voyage to the New World. Currently partly owned by Sir Ian McKellen, the pub has a long literary history, having been visited by, of course, Charles Dickens and Samuel Pepys. When a Victorian author wished to add a little lurid detail, he would choose the opium dens of Limehouse as a setting for these murky goings-on. Our last stop on this eastern part of the Thames is the pub in Rotherhithe called the Mayflower. Whilst there has been a pub on this site for hundreds of years, this building was actually only built in the 1950s after having been damaged by German bombing during the war. The pub's links with the ship that carried the Pilgrim Fathers to the New World are quite fleeting. The ship was part owned by its captain Christopher Jones, who lived in Rotherhithe, and the boat did have a brief stop there on its way from Amsterdam to Plymouth, where it actually set off for the New World. The place does make the most of its connection though, with a list of the names of the original passengers and a book which those that can prove they are direct descendants can add their names to, for the sake of posterity. We're now moving back west to Southwark, which is on the south side of the Thames, opposite the City of London. Here we have a pub that was frequented by Shakespeare himself, as well as the usual suspects. This is the George, the last galleried coaching inn left in London. Originally, 3 sides of the courtyard were galleried, and it may well be that Shakespeare and his troupe of players played in the courtyard, whilst the audience sat in the galleries above and watched them. When England was at war with France at the end of the 18th century, the Prime Minister of the time, William Pitt, put a tax on all clocks and watches. To save people having to pay the tax by buying their own clocks, pubs and inns would install a clock to give people another reason for coming to the pub. They were known as Act of Parliament clocks, and the one at the George is one of the last surviving examples. Back over the river now and a couple of miles away to the Covent Garden area, where in Rose Street you find the very atmospheric pub the Lamb and Flag, which, as well as being a favourite of Charles Dickens, as which wasn't, it also has a connection with this man, John Dryden. He was a favourite of Charles II and Britain's first poet laureate. He lived nearby and has a room in the pub dedicated to him. He was also attacked and beaten up outside the pub by a gang employed by one of his rivals, the Earl of Rochester. In the early 19th century, the pub acquired a reputation as being a venue for bare-knuckle prize fighting, and it earned the nickname the Bucket of Blood. On now round the corner to Drury Lane, where the White Hart stands. Records show a pub on this site since 1216, and therefore it claims to be London's oldest licensed premises. It was a well-known watering hole for London's thieves and highwaymen, and Drury Lane was also the home of Britain's first serial killer, Thomas Linwood, known as the Muffin Man. Between 1589 and 1598, he is said to have killed 15 children and 7 adults. Round the corner from Drury Lane is Carey Street, which is just behind the Royal Courts of Justice, at the top of Fleet Street. Here you find the Seven Stars, one of the few pubs to have escaped the fire of London in 1666. And being so close to the Royal Courts of Justice, you'll find that it's got a large selection of legal memorabilia. Back now to the East End of London and to some much more modern dirty business. Born in the 1930s, the twins Ronnie and Reggie Cray were going to be boxers, but instead they became leaders of one of London's most notorious gangs. One day in the 1960s, Ronnie Cray walked into this pub, the Blind Beggar, and murdered George Cornell in front of a number of witnesses. He then smiled and walked out again. On a more positive note, the pub was the location of William Booth's first sermon. This led to the creation eventually of the Salvation Army. From murky doings in the East End, we moved to the upper class area of Belgravia, near Hyde Park in Piccadilly. Here we find the Grenadier, a public house originally built in 1720 as the officers' mess for the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards, and located in the courtyard of their barracks. The pub is said to be haunted by the ghost of Cedric, a young soldier who was caught cheating at cards and beaten to death as a punishment. Visitors to the pub hang money from the ceiling in an attempt to pay the young man's debt. However, his ghost seems to keep appearing, mainly in September. The Duke of Wellington, who lived just round the corner, was a frequent visitor, as was King George IV. Off now to Hatton Garden, named after Sir Christopher Hatton, who was a favourite of Queen Elizabeth I. She wanted to give him a whole lot of land, so she commandeered it from the Bishop of Ely, who had a palace in this area and was originally unwilling to give up some of his land to the Queen. However, being the Queen, she was able to persuade him to do so. Ely is a cathedral town in Cambridgeshire, and the whole area remained ostensibly as part of Cambridge. This lasted right up until the end of the 20th century. The Mitre was built in 1546 for the servants of the Bishops of Ely. It's a difficult pub to find, being situated up this very narrow alleyway. When you get there, you will find its famous cherry tree that Queen Elizabeth once danced around with Sir Christopher Hatton. The tree is said to mark the boundary between the Bishop of Ely's grounds and those of Sir Christopher Hatton. Just around the corner from Hatton Garden, in an area known as Farringdon, there is this pub called the Castle, which I've included for 2 very particular reasons. Firstly, it is famous as being the only pub in the country with 2 licences. One to serve liquor, of course, and the other as a pawnbroker. This arises from the fact that King George IV, having lost money at a cockfight, borrowed money from the landlord, leaving his watch as a security. When he redeemed his watch and repaid the loan, he gave a charter to the landlord, allowing him to become a pawnbroker in the future. And this charter still stands, and you can see the brass balls, the sign of the pawnbroker, above the pub. The other reason for including it is that at the beginning of the 20th century, the landlord was this man, Harris Goodman, my grandfather. This riot of colour is the Churchill Arms in Kensington, and our last stop on this whirlwind tour of some of the pubs of London. In many ways it epitomises all that is best in London pubs. Whilst popular with visitors, of course, it remains a local as well, where people can just go and sit and chat over a pint. With a good choice of local ales and very friendly bar staff, it's a great place to sit and while away a few hours. The pub is stacked with all sorts of memorabilia, obviously quite a lot of it relating to Sir Winston Churchill. And you won't be surprised to know that it often wins prizes for its colourful floral displays. There are over 3,500 pubs in London, so we've only scratched the surface. I hope you want to come back and see some more. Goodbye.